mantenerla, if you don't mind to keep the mask while you don't talk. Bien. No, cuando hablemos mantenemos la... a todos.
Welcome everyone to this new conference in Casa Árabe on geopolitics and climate in the Mediterranean region. We have our speaker with us. He is very knowledgeable in these matters. Is from the university in Hamburg. Jürgen Scheffran, thank you so very much for joining us today. I do think you need your receivers, you need headsets to be able to follow the interpretation.
The came to be here. I'm just going to explain some small introduction about the program for the students, and then we pass to your conference. So, sí, el que haya podido viajar con...
Well, you've made it here in spite of all the difficulties of international travel during the pandemic, and thanks to that, we have you here in person. This is the second session of our conference cycle in this third edition of university programs from the universities in Madrid and Cordoba, on this occasion in collaboration with the Master of the EU, Master's Degree Program on EU and the Mediterranean from the Complutense University in Madrid. And that is why today we have Ruth Ferrero-Turion with us. She is a professor in political science in the master I just mentioned. So thank you very much for joining us today again. And I'd like also to bid you students welcome, and also the ones who are joining us from the branch of philosophy, and also obviously everyone who is logged in from afar. You know that Aula Árabe Universitaria is a university cooperation program that Casa Árabe organizes with various universities. We deal with the Arab and Islamic world in the widest sense, and according to the requests we receive from the universities. This year we have 25 university and PhD degrees from Madrid University and Cordoba University, with 17 conferences during the academic year, and you can look this up in our web for more information. Just for the purpose of certification, if you attend more than 50% of the conferences, you will get the certification. To this end, we are going to give you a printed passport for the Arab world, you will get a stamp that acknowledges that you have been in attendance of the various conference. Up to now, we've used forms online, but you have been registered nonetheless through the YouTube channel also, and this is done for every conference. And when you request your certificate, we will be merging the data, so don't worry, we really keep track of what's what. So the next conference is going to be happening with John Tolan on the Quran on the 27th of October. Furthermore, if you want information on the program and you don't want to look it up in the web, just subscribe in Casa Árabe for our news bulletins. And just click on Aula Árabe Universitaria and you will get it sent to you. Usually it is done indirectly, but this way you can access the information directly. And those who are logged on online, you just have to register online too. And without further ado, let's move on to the subject matter at hand. The Mediterranean region connects or links up the south of Europe with the north of Africa and with the west of Asia. And it's a critical area. It's an area where various conflicts, geopolitical conflicts, come together, and they might ripple in their effects. This region is very much affected by climate change, and that is a multiplier for risks and can compound natural disasters, lack of food and water, and energy scarcity, and this entails migration and the ensuing crises. Therefore, climate changes do reduce the available resources in this region, a region that is growing, and we see that the crisis is being exacerbated. So, Professor Scheffran is going to be telling us on the awareness about the common challenges related to climate in the region, climate diplomacy, water, energy, the networks of information exchange, and other mechanisms. Without further ado, let's hear Ruth Herrero, who is going to be introducing our speaker, and then we'll listen to this speaker proper, obviously. Good afternoon, everyone. It's lovely to be here in person again after so much Zoom and so much virtual meeting. Well, I don't know. Would you have me rather speak English, or you're listening to the interpretation, right? Maybe better in Spanish for the students. Now, this conference and having Professor Scheffran here with us today in this conference cycle has a lot to do with the concerns that we deal with in our master. We approach it in a systematical way in our curricular content, climate change, human mobility processes, and so on. That is part of our program, and we thought it was most interesting to connect the dots of knowledge already contained in our program with everything related to security and with geopolitics, especially in the way Professor Scheffran deals with this in his work. Olivia has already broached briefly his field of expertise, but let me especially deal with pathways to water conflict during drought in the MENA region. That is the water geopolitics as a vector that directly impacts on the stability and the security concepts in the region. And secondly, also linking water resources, forced migration and tensions with host communities in the Nigerian Chad Basin. that's yet another piece of work that links up water, human mobility, that is forced migration, and in this case, the societies people migrate to, and this can also affect the cohesion of said societies. Without further ado, I'll give the word to our speaker. We are very interested in listening to you. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much. Oh. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction and the invitation to this very nice place. I was not aware of this building, but it's a very interesting experience to see it and to have the opportunity to talk here about an important subject. And you have already given some introduction into some of the key topics, and I will go more into depth of some of these issues. I hope language is not a problem. My Spanish is not good enough to speak to you in Spanish, so I use English, which is also not my native language. Okay, first of all, I want to start with a good message that the Nobel Prize in Physics was awarded today to my colleague Klaus Hasselmann in Hamburg. He established the climate program in the 1970s. And this climate program is one of the leading programs in climate research, as you can see from the Nobel Prize in Physics today. This was also awarded to complex systems because the climate system is a very complex system. So during this hour, there is some celebration in Hamburg going on. I got some email, but I cannot attend. So I can attend here and celebrate it from here. Okay, so this is a very nice opportunity to talk about climate change and its impacts, in particular the social dimensions and the security dimensions and the conflict dimensions of climate change, which is not so much about physics, but about society and politics. You may be aware about some of these risks of climate change, and this map shows just some of these implications. Climate change is a global phenomenon, but the implications in each region are very different. You can see in some regions you have the impacts of high temperature, including heat events. And we had in recent years a lot of these heat events, in particular in the Mediterranean region. There was very dry, and this means that plants can be burning because of this drought and heat conditions. In other areas, you have a lot of water from falling from the sky because warmer air takes more precipitation, and this precipitation and water comes down at some location. And you have floods and storms. And this year we had in Germany a dramatic flooding event in west part of Germany, where more than 200 people were killed, and the whole area was devastated. Basically every house was more or less affected. So too much water, too little water, too much heat. These are some of the problems. You see that some of the issues in Africa can become very dramatic because of the heat, but also because of the flooding. In South Asia, you expect more flooding and strong storms, as well as in East Asia and in Central America. You can see hurricanes and all these things. In addition, you have the impact on the biological world, on the vegetation, on animals and plants, which have problems to keep up with the speed of change. Climate change was in the past existing, in particular from the changes from the ice ages. Between the ice ages, there was several degrees temperature change, and it was much cooler in Europe, in particular in Northern Europe. The Hamburg area was under a big cover of ice sheet, 100-meter high, and life was not possible at that time. So you see some natural variation in the climate, but since humans have emitted carbons and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, the fluctuation of the climate, the variability of climate, and the trend towards warming has been dramatically increasing. And this affects, of course, also the glaciers of the planet, the polar region. You have an additional melting of ice, which leads to sea level rise, which affects then all coastal regions, which are often very populated. And then you have also dramatic changes in the system, like the shift of ocean currents, like in the North Atlantic, the Gulf Stream, and so on, and the melting of the ice in soil, in particular in Siberia and Russia, which is accelerating these days, and this is releasing methane into the atmosphere, which is one aggressive greenhouse gas. This is speeding up the process. Okay, also rainforests can die and so on. So many of these impacts and implications may affect our future. And people in the past have thought we still have several decades, so it may not affect our lives. But you are young, and your life is several decades in the future, so it affects you probably more than me in the future. Now the question is, to this phenomenon of increasing climate change, how do societies respond? There are two possibilities. One is leading to more security risks and conflict and instability, and also refugee movement is a possibility, which is the red path here. And then you have a green path of finding solutions to the problem. The more the problem increases, the more solution can increase. And we have seen also protest movements in recent years trying to find solutions to this problem, like Fridays for Future. And the question is, which is faster? The increase of the problem and the destabilization of society, or the solutions finding a way out and stabilizing the society? There's a competition between these pathways, which is the future action window. Now, looking at the climate risk pathway, you see also the possibility that you have more violent conflict in the future, and that the military will take on of these issues, intervening and interfering with these conflicts. And there have been a number of studies over the past 10 to 20 years looking into the security risks of climate change, like a group of former military generals and admirals in the United States saying that climate change is a security risk for the United States as a country. Similar in Germany, the German Advisory Council on Global Environmental Change in 2007 suggested the possibility that climate change can destabilize societies and the whole world if climate policy is not effective. And then, as I mentioned, there is more interest in the military. There's a study that was done by Michael Clare. He looked at how the Pentagon in the United States may respond to climate change, because if everything is becoming unstable, more conflicts emerge, then the military can see some tasks. This was in 2007, and since then, an increasing number of studies in the sector of the security experts and the military have looked into the different implications of climate change on international and national security. And you see just the number of studies is getting so rapidly increasing, looking at sea level change, how this affects military operations in the world, and how the military might respond to the increasing conflict. So that may mean that this could be one of the responses, more military responses to conflict. When you look at the number of conflicts in the world since World War II, so since 1945, you see there had been a gradual rise of the number of conflict till around 1990. Okay, that was the maximum. And then there was a drop of conflict, and the conflict declined after the Cold War. And since about 2010, and since then the number of conflicts have been again rising. And it's still not so clear what the reasons are behind the rise of these conflicts. And we have now more conflict than even in 1990 in the world, violent armed conflict. And many of them in Africa and Asia, but also some in Europe and in America. So this is raising the question, what the geopolitical implications of climate change on security are. And we may face very complex geopolitical landscape. And many of them are soft security in the sense it's not violent, but it's undermining human security. So the existence of humans losing their house, their home, and getting health problems is also possible. These are the soft security issues. But on the other hand, the hard security issues are the one where violence is used, where the military intervenes. And this depends a bit on the vulnerability of humans and the vulnerability of societies. And there are three terms important for vulnerability. One is to be exposed to a climate event. The second one is this, how sensitive you respond to the climate event and how strongly you are affected by it. And the third is how you try to find solutions, how you adapt, adaptive capacity to these problems, in case you cannot avoid the problem. And this raises also the question of different security dimensions. I mentioned human security, but there is also environmental security as a possibility besides national and international security. So many security dimensions can be affected, in particular if you have the risks are multiplying with each other. So aggravating. It's not only one risk at one point, you have different risks at several points which can accumulate. Yeah, you have cumulative risk or compound risk when different factors and problems come together, like the risk between climate and the pandemic, also between economic crisis and climate change, or a real war and climate change. So these factors can combine, and that makes it a bit difficult to handle these complex problems. In particular, if in some regions these factors multiply at one certain location, like in Africa or in the Middle Eastern countries, where there's already conflict, okay? And then these conflicts combine with climate change. There are different possibility pathways between climate and conflict, like water issues, or food problems, or migration problems. I will say more about this. The question, how are the pathways linked? When the radiation from the sun is heating the planet more than without humans, this has an effect on natural resources like soil. It can become more dry and less available for agriculture and also for cattle. So this can undermine the living conditions of people, and this leads to resource problems and possible conflict. So this is one part of the loop. Okay, it could be also the other way around. This loop that you have increasing conflict undermines agricultural conditions for farmers and herders, and this reduces the problem for protecting resources in a sustainable manner, and also undermines the conditions for solving the climate problem. So more climate means more conflict means more climate problems, okay? And this is this two-way interaction which has to be considered. Now, this is a theory part, but what about the empirical part? There have been, since over the last 15 years, a number of studies looking at the empirical links between climate and conflict, and we have been taking part in this discussion, and there was an article in Science magazine where we looked at the link between climate and violent conflict, and we found that around half of the quantitative studies found a link, significant link between climate and conflict. The other half was either no link or an ambiguous link. Okay, it was not so fully clear, this picture. So since then there is some debate how strong the climate effect on conflict actually is, because there are many drivers of conflict before climate change emerged. Historical studies found a stronger impact on climate, on conflict, like in the Little Ice Age, between the 14th and 17th, 18th century. It was cooler actually in Europe at that time. Not so much because of the impact of humans, because maybe volcanic eruptions or the impact of the sun had a stronger effect, but had an effect on human living conditions in Europe. The The winter was longer and the growing season was shorter. At that time, the European population was rising. So that contributed to some conflict. And there wasn't actually a significant link between climate and conflict in this period. Not a very strong link, but it was observable at least. So there was a cooling effect, also having possible effect. So basically, humans live in an average zone of the climate. If it's too hot or too cold, then humans have problems because they're not used to this changing conditions. So this is one outcome. In recent decades, however, it was not so clear what the link was, and when many studies, I think it's now on the order of more than 100 studies looking at these linkages, and they found several impact factors like population growth has an effect on the climate conflict link, or the vulnerability of people, a low development level has an effect. The level of economic growth, the level of democracy in countries, all these are intervening factors that shape the climate conflict link. Okay, there is it's not so easy because climate change is many phenomena, and there are also different conflict phenomena. So it's not just one variable against one variable, you have many variables which are connected to each other. So you have, of course, national wars, international wars between countries, but you have also communal violence between small-scale communities or between herders and farmers in Africa. And all these are now studied quantitatively as well as qualitatively in case studies. So we have done some case studies to understand that relationship. It's also not so easy because it's not only that climate change can increase conflict, I mentioned it can also increase cooperation because people take more efforts against the violence, okay? So this is not so much studied, the climate cooperation link, in comparison to the climate conflict link. In recent years, there have been more georeference data, like location of conflict, time of conflict is correlated with climate events, extreme events, and so on. And there are multiple pathways here that are important. And the question of tipping points is something that came up also in recent times, which is a non-linear phenomenon. You have not a linear relationship between variables, but in the beginning it's linear, and then you have a jump in the effect of a variable. Now, what is also important is to understand the impact of institutions and governance mechanisms. Policies for resilience building, for sustainability, can they moderate this climate conflict relationship? Okay, and then in addition to the quantitative studies, there's also some modeling going on. Now, in an article in Nature in 2019, there was a group of experts was involved to find out solutions and to understand the state of the research in this field. On the one hand side, on the left hand side is conflict risk, on the right hand side is climate change risk, and how these are interfering with each other, and how this can be affected by governance and by groups in society, like non-governmental organizations have an effect. Now, the research going on now is trying to understand the pathways between climate and conflict, and there can be many pathways, as I already mentioned. One is like impact from climate on food, and then from food on conflict. Climate on water, from water on conflict. On migration, conflict. Natural disasters, also, and so on. So also biodiversity can be included and so on as linkage factors, and these are increasingly studied. Now, this multiplier, risk multiplier effect in region hotspots is important. I will also mention then this for the Mediterranean region, which is my main focus. You have to consider all these different factors like environmental degradation, desertification, water scarcity, food insecurity, the impact on critical supply networks and infrastructures, which are important for society, also the health systems, the wealth creation system, electricity systems can be affected by climate change and can contribute to conflict. Then you have these socioeconomic problems, unemployment, inequality, social divisions, which can be aggravated by climate conditions. Then the demographic drivers, I mentioned population growth, but also ethnic diversity, migration, and urbanization are important factors. And then political issues. The marginalized groups are more sensitive to climate change, and you have inequality in a society, which can aggravate the problem. And the question is, how democracies respond and how authoritarian governance respond. There's quite different responses. Some say authoritarian responses can respond faster, but they are not supported by their populations in the long run and cannot solve the problems because of that reason. Now looking at the map again in terms of now these different climate security hotspots, where some of these problems aggravate into climate security risk and conflict. And you see that, for instance, in Africa, you have the Northern Africa, Mediterranean, and also Southern Europe and Middle Eastern countries are one of the most sensitive climate hotspots in the world. Then you have the Sahel zone, you have South Africa because of water and food problems. Then you have South Asia and East Asia. You have these flood and storm events which can destabilize society. Bangladesh is often used as an important case, but Pakistan has had very severe flooding events in recent years. Then you have Central, North and South America. You have the impact on the rainforest and the societies there, and hurricanes, and the Pacific region, and also the Arctic region. The Arctic region, besides the Mediterranean, is also one of the most sensitive to climate change because of the melting of the ice, and it also takes more heat because of the melting of the ice. And also, because of the melting of the ice, you have a better access to fossil fuels in this region. Okay, and there's a competition now on oil and gas in this region between the major powers, the United States, Russia, Europe. Also China plays a role in the Arctic now, and other countries also want to take part in this competition for resources. But if more oil and gas is released from the Arctic, that is another factor, a political factor leading to more conflict, because the climate change is also accelerating because of that reason. Now let's look at the Mediterranean region in particular. And you see, of course, in Northern Africa, you have already drought conditions. You have desert or semi-desert region, arid regions. This extends also into the Middle Eastern countries. But now you have along the coast and parts of Morocco, you have agriculture. But this is then under pressure. If the Sahara region moves more northward because of climate change conditions, this puts more heat into this region. And this can also affect Europe, and South Europe in particular. You have big rivers like the Nile River, the Jordan River, the Euphrates and Tigris River. It could also become more under pressure because of this less rainfall conditions, and that can accelerate the conflict in a region which is already prone to conflict. Could be a contributing factor. Then you have the sea level change, affects also the Mediterranean Sea, and affects the Nile Delta in particular. And there's a big city, Alexandria, for instance, that could be flooded. But also all low-lying coasts will have some sea level effect. It could be between 60 centimeters and 1 meter by end of this century. Now, can we see also some effects on societies because of climate change? And here, very often, the Arabic Spring is used as an example, which started 10 years ago in January in Tunisia. Was one person protesting against the authorities, and this then escalated. Yeah? And it was, in the beginning, started as a so-called bread protest. Some people were having food problems because there was, as you see on the lower left graph, a strong rise of the food price before 2008. Then there was the economic crisis, there was a drop. And then again, even more after the economic crisis in 2008. 2010-11 was the maximum of the food price, exactly when the Arab Spring started. Now the question is, what was the reason for this food price increase? There are many reasons, yeah, like international speculations on the the land problems in the world. Yeah, there's less land available, also because of maybe bioenergy and other uses. There was the food price was also the oil price was also increasing, but it was interesting to see that before the Arab Spring started, there was some major droughts in China, Russia, and other countries, which lead to some scarcity of wheat. The wheat market was under pressure, and this was a contributing factor. So if you have 4 or 5 factors, you cannot say what is the most decisive one. In a complex system, you can never say it's only one factor. It's all these different factors, but these drought and heat conditions contributed to this situation, even if you cannot say how much. Okay, and you all know what happened. It was a political movement to Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Syria, even to Yemen. Was an uprising, and there were big hopes at that time. Yeah? You all probably have your own opinion how much these hopes were fulfilled, but at least you can say it was a destabilizing factor in some sense, because even you can overthrow a government, but the question is what comes after, is it better? And in some cases, yes, but in other cases, not. And this is the point. You see the domino effect of the governments falling. This is one of these cascading events that often are associated now with climate change conditions. And one of the worst effects occurred in Syria. It led to a civil war. The Assad regime was not overthrown. It was a civil war which still is going on. It's not finished, even though now the government has the upper hand in this situation. But it was a very bloody war. Many people were killed and many people were becoming refugees from this region. But the interesting thing is the years before the Syrian war, in 2008-9, there was one of the biggest droughts ever in this region, affecting Syria particularly, and the farmers in Syria, which moved away from their rural areas, partly into the urban areas. And this, some say, is an important factor. Others, like a colleague in Hamburg, saying, interviewing people actually in Jordan who came from Syria, they did not see a major effect of climate change. This, in a complex system, you can never say. This is the problem. Why did you leave your home? Was it climate change or was it the political conditions? But in the systemic environment, you have one contributing factor again. Okay, now this leads me to the climate-induced migration debate. And we had also in the last decade 2 flows of movements of people. One across the Mediterranean, the so-called boat people, mostly coming from African countries, from Sahel, North Africa, and then trying to move to Europe. And you have the others coming on the land pathway, the Balkan routes, moving into Central Europe, in particular to Germany. This led to the so-called migration crisis. And then again, this combined with the climate change debate in 2015 in particular. And there was some saying climate change was the main driver, but others were more cautious. We shouldn't be too alarmist because the people had many reasons to move away. The Syrian crisis, of course, in civil war was a driver, whatever the climate effect on that conflict was. Okay, but the critical approach, a question that not everybody who is affected by climate change becomes a refugee or a migrant. Some even try to avoid the term refugee because refugee is defined by the Geneva Convention. What a refugee is, political reason, is a refugee. So people now say it's displaced people. They were displaced of climate change. So this is now one of the debates, what is the right term. And the multi-causal effect, again, for migration, climate change is a contributing factor, but the question is how much. I was part in a German commission on the root causes of displacement, which presented its report to the German government in May. Climate change was one factor, one chapter in this report. And this is the group of people, and they were looking at, first of all, at the different drivers of migration. You see many drivers, and climate change is environmental degradation. Climate change is only one, besides demographic pressure or lack of economic and social progress, prospects, and conflict, of course, and smuggling networks of people. So multiple factors here in this graph, as well as multiple solutions. In each of these fields, you can think about solutions, and the biggest part of this study was about finding solutions. And the study suggested that the global north and the global south should collaborate to address the climate problem as a driver of migration and displacement, forced displacement. And there should, when Germany, for instance, is investing in climate change, they should match this investment with investment in the south. Okay? That because Germany alone will never solve the climate problem. At the same time, other countries increase their emissions, so there must be some balance of collaboration between both parts here. This is called climate matching. Climate adaptation is important, as well as urban development, in a way that the cities are not the drivers of climate change, but also not so much affected by the disasters of climate change, which then could become a driver of migration. Okay, now we are moving towards climate diplomacy and more towards the solution side, as you see. To limit the geopolitical consequences of climate change, it's important to have cooperative policies, institutional mechanisms to deal with these complex interactions, both on the European side, as well as in the Middle Eastern countries, North African countries, and the collaboration between both. Despite all the conflicts that are in this region, I think Europe has very strong economy and technology. On the other hand, in the MENA region, there are a lot of resources available, including not only fossil resources, but solar and other renewable resources. And this could be an opportunity for collaboration. There's also land available that could be used and so on. So both should take best strength of their capabilities. However, there are still obstacles to this cooperation, like the geopolitical competition in this region. The impact of major powers in this region is somehow limiting the effect of cooperation. And we should avoid that this climate problem is securitized, security issue, but desecuritized. So we should avoid military responses to the climate problem, at least the ones that deal with the violent effects of climate change. So we should move away from the so-called vicious cycle. The vicious cycle means the problems are aggravating, towards a virtuous cycle, that the solutions are multiplying and finding synergies in each different policy field. And this is a challenge, moving away from this negative nexus of problems towards a positive nexus of synergies and solutions. And we are still at the beginning of trying to find solutions and how they can multiply, not from a risk multiplier towards a solution multiplier. Okay, and this is the challenge. We cannot solve the problems in just one policy field. They all must work together. Okay, and then we can possibly make this transition, as I showed you in the beginning, through a cascade of events or multiple tipping points. The tipping points you see, you have here climate stress. This is a certain moment in time, and you see you can run to a cascading events of negative effects. But you could also move to upward towards positive tipping points, that the solutions are multiplying. And of course, the more you move down this negative pathway, the more difficult it becomes to move upward. Once you are caught in this violent nexus, it's difficult to move the cooperation nexus. That's the challenge we are currently facing. I'm not sure exactly where we are now. Maybe we are somewhere here, and somewhere still in the middle, hopefully avoiding this downward slope. Okay, and energy can be an important field, of course. Energy is a main driver, one main driver of climate change. The fossil energy path is having the biggest emissions, and this region is Middle Eastern, North African countries are rich in fossil energy sources. How can we convince them to give up on these fossil energy sources? It's their wealth. How can we convince also Saudi Arabia to give up on fossil energy sources? Only if they are part of the boat of the decision-making process in the other countries as well, and maybe they get some compensation, or convince them to move away towards the other strength, which is solar energy. This is the biggest source of the Mediterranean region, which is also the reason that we have fossil fuels. The sun fossil fuel is nothing like the stored energy of the sun in the past. So now let's move away from the past and use the energy of the future, which is solar and other renewables. Okay, this is a challenge. How can we make that transition despite these unfortunate political conditions? And energy cooperation is important in this field to make this transformation and move towards low-carbon societies in Europe and as well as in the other parts of this region. The Mediterranean share of CO2 emissions at this point is 6% of the global approximately. Maybe not too much, but it's still significant. And there's also population rise in this region, which means more need for energy, and there's a factor 4 increase of the population, which can be an issue in the future. And there's also low energy, renewable energy investment. It's only between 1 and 4% of the global investment in renewables, so it could be much more. And the Mediterranean Solar Plan could be one way of dealing with it. Has invested 15 to 16 billion euros. We have to overcome the investment barriers in this region, and there are some positive examples, like wind power plants in the ocean in Egypt, which has about $500 million of investment for a 200 megawatt wind power project in the Gulf of Al Said. And in Morocco, 635 million for a 160 megawatt solar plant, or Ouarzazate plant. There have been ideas about very visionary projects like the Desertec project or the climate correction project, which could attract much more investment in the future, and not only from this region, but also from Europe. There was the idea, it was also born in Hamburg, this idea of Desertec, by another physics colleague, Gerhard Knies, about 15, 20 years ago. His idea was, Europe and North Africa and the Middle Eastern countries should bring in their investments and their energy to develop the desert energy, with concentrated solar power plants. And the idea is this energy, this area of the desert would be enough to produce world electricity. But it's not so easy. This project died basically after 2011, the Arab Spring, because of the instability in this region. The German investors withdrew from this project. There was also critique saying, is this a neo-colonial project which is only in the interest of Europe? But it depends on the conditions, of course. It depends on the conditions that both sides have a benefit from it as well as the planet. And this is still a challenge for the future, whether this or similar projects could work. And then we could have these multiple securities combined in a positive way, because energy is very important for this region. It's also important for water. For instance, desalination plants need energy. And you can produce water even in the desert region. Or you have socioeconomic and climate security combined. So this is one of these positive nexus ideas, bringing the positive securities together. Yeah? And this is one graph showing it. Now, there are different possibilities for frameworks towards joint initiatives to bridge the asymmetries in this region by collaboration, to stabilize the region, and develop multilateral cooperative approaches to minimize the violence and integrate development, foreign investment, and migration networks in a positive way. Migrants are not a problem as such. They could also contribute to the solution of the problems. They're also connecting North and South. And this is also a new idea, that the migrants can be connectors between North and South. There is a so-called Euro-Mediterranean partnership, which tries to bring in different regimes together, like migration and health, or energy and water security, climate and environmental protection, employment, and also reduction of terrorism in this region. I think, why don't we speak about a Mediterranean New Deal? There is a so-called European New Deal by European Commission. Why not about Mediterranean New Deal, where all these strengths of all the different parts of the region can combine and integrate it. And the European Union is having some initiatives that are supporting the Mediterranean in particular. There's also the so-called strategic partnership between European Union and the southern neighborhood, and even an economic and investment plan. So some financial transfer towards this region is then needed. And this could be also connected to the so-called New Deal for engagement in fragile states. So these are fragile states are the ones that are most sensitive to these different problems. There have been attempts of partnerships between Europe, Middle East, and North Africa. The first one was the member states of the Euro-Mediterranean Partnership between 1995 and 2008. You see, it includes most of Europe, Middle Eastern countries, and North African countries. That was not so successful, so they came up with the Union for the Mediterranean since 2008 that was trying to combine all these different policy fields, excluding military and security issues. Yeah. But environment could be a field of collaboration. Now, the European Union can also support this in certain ways, and they have some activities that could be connected to the European Green Deal, which aims for net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And some countries in South Europe are part of this idea and are well in a good position, I think, to collaborate with their neighbors in North Africa and Middle Eastern countries. Then there is the common foreign and security policy, which is also an element of a climate diplomacy program and with bilateral dialogues. There is a common security and defense policy, which is also focusing on climate change increasingly. It has even a climate change and defense roadmap to enhance synergies between different tools and instruments like weather forecasting or early warning, conflict analysis, and even civilian activities. This is, of course, closer to defense. Yeah? So we should be careful not to focus too much on the military aspect of it, but more on the civilian side. Then the new neighborhood development and international cooperation instrument is an instrument with which also a lot of money, 80 billion euros between 21 and 27 is planned, with 30% of the budget going to climate, and the climate and energy diplomacy activity, which aims for a doubling of financial commitments, 23 billion between 2013 and 19. So we are now in the order of dozens of billions of euros going into addressing these climate security issues. Then we have, beyond the region, we have other activities like all the major external powers, United States, Russia, China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, which are in competition, even in conflict, could also be more in cooperation, in collaboration, when you think about exploring the opportunities for renewable energy. Then we have multiple dialogues at the OSCE level, NATO level, and United Nations level. For instance, the NATO has a focus on climate security and instability in the MENA region, and a network of partnerships in the so-called Mediterranean dialogue. And part of this is the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative. Then we have the United Nations, is also very active in this region, and particularly related to climate change in terms of cross-sectoral integration. Sustainable development goals are very important globally, but for each region. You probably know them, or some of them. Then there's the Sendai framework and disaster risk reduction, and also the climate change adaptation policies, which in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which has on the order of $100 billion dollars per year. Then on the peace side, United Nations is also very active there. The Department of Peacekeeping Operations, there are 2 peacekeeping operations with relevance here, like the UNAMI in Iraq and MINUSMA in Mali, also trying to keep violence under certain control. And they also raise climate stressors on these conflicts. Then the UN Security Council had 3 times major sessions since the year 2007 on climate change, one driven by the United Kingdom and also by Germany, to bring this to the UN Security Council, climate change. This was not fully successful because many countries don't want that the Security Council is dealing with climate change. They say it's an environmental issue. And the Security Council is dealing with security, violence, hard security issues usually. So in particular, some of the developing countries are very anxious about putting this there, and some have reasons for that. Then, I mentioned the UN Framework Convention, and then there's the activity of Germany. This year we have a third of the so-called Berlin Climate Security Conferences, 2019, 20, 21. In the German Foreign Ministry, they focus on climate security issues. They have also some high-ranking speakers. These days is the third one going on. Bringing this to the UN Security Council is still a German activity. So this is more the security side. On the other hand, the climate side is the next big conference in Glasgow in Scotland in November. And we have the UN Framework Convention and the Paris Agreement in 2015, which means almost all countries in the world agreed on this, to limit climate change to 1.5 to 2 degrees. So there are a lot of activities on the global level, at the European level, at the national level, but also at the small-scale level of communities, cities, and this is a network formation process, which is very important. We should not only look at the big players, but also at the small players, even to the individuals. And you see, again, the role of a movement. Now we have 2 regions here, Europe and MENA. We have governmental actors, we have business actors, science actors, and education, like this institution here. We have civil society and NGOs, and we have the whole population. And both, they can collaborate on all these levels. They can form networks between business and science, or with civil society, which we actually have, increasingly building. I have drawn this 10 years ago, but we see increasingly this network formation processes within each region, but across these regions. I think we need to work much more on this network formation process across all the different levels. It's then called transnational governance across the nations. And this matrix shows you some examples. Yeah, and this is governmental, population, business, science actors, and NGOs in the MENA region, and this is for the European level. What kind of possible collaboration projects are between governments, of course, between populations. For instance, remittances is one important issue. The migrants send remittances to their home countries. This is just the individual citizens can take part in this. Or a lot of business interactions here, investment frameworks, consumption, trade, technology transfer, and so on, between the different players and the NGOs forming democratic processes, strengthening human rights, forming social networks, and so on. So we can do more to fill this matrix, actually. Then we have a full collaboration if we have no blank spaces left. And I think you all can contribute to this, whatever your future role will be. So important is to build capacities to solve the problems, human, social, and absorptive capacities. Capacity building is essential of the people, as well as scientific and technical skills, and education and training are an important part of this. And I'll just show you some activities I've been involved in the last 10 years. This was a series of conferences in the German Foreign Ministry on climate security dialogue, and we had one session on the South Mediterranean region. It's also 2011. This was same year we had in Egypt climate science diplomacy meeting. Unfortunately, at the same day we had this meeting, the situation in Egypt was escalating and was turning more violent. We were passing with our bus. On the left side was the protesters, on the right hand side was the military, and our bus was passing through, and after that the military tanks were driving over the protesters, and there was an escalation and a riot in that night occurring. You see how close these things can be together between cooperation and conflict on the same day. We had also an excursion here to a solar power plant, and we organized a workshop in 2015 with PhD students on climate security issues. Okay, I'm moving towards the end now. Two concepts that are very important in this field is not only security matters, peace also matters. Peace is a much older concept, and security means security against a threat, against someone. Peace means involving others, forming a social unit together. And this is the concept of peace. And two concepts are important. Sustainable peace means the idea to minimize conflict by satisfying the people's needs as a precondition for peace. If people are dissatisfied, unpeaceful behavior and violent behavior is becoming more likely. And to make that possible, this sustainable transformation possible, we should avoid the conflicts in the transition towards a new world, towards a more sustainable world without climate change. There are also conflicts on that pathway. Like biomass, I mentioned, if you have bioenergy for reducing climate impact, you need land. That can lead to land use conflict. Or wind power protests are in Germany, people protesting against wind power. Or have big solar power plants, and some people protest against that. So we should deal with these conflicts of renewable transition because it means major change. And so we should minimize these conflicts on this pathway. And we should strengthen the so-called co-benefit, co-production, co-education, and all these co-words to strengthen the synergies in this field. So sustainable peace, I mentioned, is one concept. Satisfaction of human needs is always the main condition here. And the other is environmental peace. This idea of environmental peace building is use solving the environmental problems as a contribution to reduce conflict. This is the idea. And because once people work on water together or on growing fields, they are less inclined, have less incentive to kill each other. So this is one idea. This is a growing field, is environmental peace building. Two examples here in the end. One is the so-called diaspora networks in Morocco, which means people who move from Morocco to France, Italy, Germany, are still connected to the home countries, send remittance back, or can we use this income they created for development in their home countries? Even development for water, or development for electricity with renewable energy, and so on. This was an organization, Migration et Développement, founded, had projects in 420 villages. This is a grassroots initiative of migrant organizations. The other one is called Program Against Drought. The migrants in Europe built projects for rainwater collection in Morocco and for water resources management. And another example is a joint water project, so EcoPeace Good Water Neighbors Project, between Israeli, Palestinian, and Jordanian people working together in these water projects. Okay, it must be organized in some way. It's not easy because these conflicts, the societies are in conflict with each other. But some people want to do it. This grassroots initiative can be a very important factor. It can be meetings. It can be actually technologies developed and so on that help solving the problem. And this is my last slide. Sorry, it took a little longer. Integrated framework is important, of course, to bring different activities together, like regulation, financial incentives, regional electricity market integrations in renewable energy projects, knowledge and technology transfer, energy partnerships, knowledge platforms shared between partners, and different institutes like the Euro-Mediterranean Energy Institute. Okay, and these are just some ideas of moving away from the conflict to the cooperation. And I hope we got some ideas and we have a good discussion now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for such a big, comprehensive explanation. Well, congratulations for the Nobel Prize to your university. I'm sure you missed the celebration. I hope they continue, and then you can join them next days. I think it was very interesting that you also mentioned, I'm going to take this out, the relationship between climate change and the Arab Spring, or the so-called Arab Spring, because we have been this year celebrating the 10th anniversary of the Arab Springs and analyzing it from different dimensions. So it's very interesting because it was raised the issue of how the drought had an impact on the Syrian conflict and others on the issue of the bread prices, as you mentioned. So I think it's important, as you said, I like what you said about the complex systems. You have different factors coming together. You cannot point it out to one, but everything, you have to study different factors. I think it's that very interesting way of analyzing them. And thank you for commenting on, because I think you touch upon almost everything related to climate change and violence in the Mediterranean. So I think thank you very much I hope the students and the public, the audience, enjoy it. We have some questions from the people that are following us online. I don't know if Ruth, you want to mention something or start with some comments or questions. O lo que tú quieras, él tiene lo que quieras, si quieres se pone la interpretación o lo que quieras.
Thank you for your very interesting speech. And I have some questions on how you see all this involvement, this financial movement towards fight climate change, and from your point of view, how you see if they're efficient enough to reach the main actors involved with the causes of the conflicts and the climate change in origin. I have my doubts on that. I mean, at some point, yes, every multilateral institutions and organizations and governments in the global north are very worried about how to fight against climate change, but when it takes to the global south, the actors to which they are interacting, I don't think they are the right ones. I mean, there are the governments, but of course the governments, everyone knows what the democracy quality, how it is in those countries. So I don't know if you did some research on that, and how to have more efficient use of the funds dedicated to climate change in the global south and also in the global north as well, because at some point there are no public policies focused on stop by the climate change, and now you have these discussions, these big discussions in Berlin with the Green Party trying to get to form government, and I know that they are taking out all these proposals on the growth policies because they seem too radical. So, you know, it is nice to see the picture, the big picture, the multilateral organizations, the European Union giving money to these countries and to fight against climate change in general. But I'm not quite sure if this is, I think this is continuous of this, how to say, rough capitalism which reaches to the position in which we are now.
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. Obviously, the previous efforts are not enough because we have been seeing increasing emissions in the world, but they have to go down to nearly zero. Okay, and this is the challenge. All our life, our wealth, depends on these emissions and the associated energy, which is still about 80% fossil energy. You know? So depending on, for each country, different. So we are still far away from what is needed. And the governments are cautious. Even also the German government, they had responded to the protests in Germany from Fridays for Future and in 2019, but their response was far away from what is needed to solve the climate problem and meet Germany's obligations. Now we see what the new government that is being formed these days will come up with, but we see similar resistances that people don't want to diminish their wealth at the cost of climate policy. Yeah, and it's also a social issue. The poor people don't want to pay the climate bill, but many of the rich people also don't want to pay the climate bill. And they are very anxious to protect and preserve their wealth, which depends on these emissions. We have to convince the people that they can keep some of their wealth, or most of their wealth actually, maybe even all of their wealth, if they create this wealth without emissions. This is the challenge, making people happy without emissions. And it's indeed possible if you completely move away from fossil to low carbon energy or zero carbon energy, then you can keep most of your wealth. This is the challenge, but there's some cost of this transition. Somebody has to pay for it. And the government is expected to pay much of this investment of making that transition. But if you say all levels should contribute to this transition, then it's not only the government we have to wait for. It can be done at community level, at city levels. And here even the United States is doing its share. Some big cities want to accelerate this process. Despite the 4 years we have lost with Donald Trump, he ignored completely the climate problem. And many in the United States still want to. Biden administration has said, yes, we need to do something on climate change. But it's also a societal task. It's a whole society task. If all levels work together, I think we have a chance. But it's a time issue. We are under time pressure.
Tenemos 4 preguntas que nos están mandando.
We do have 4 questions that we're getting online. Maybe someone here in person wants to break the ice? Do we have a microphone? Well, while we wait for the mic, I can...
There are questions from the public here. We have the ones online. And I'm going to collect two that are related to the two questions are related to the Nile, so I'm just to collect it and then I take your questions. One question from Professor Barah Mikhail is Egypt amongst the most vulnerable countries, especially since issues related to the Nile River seem to create further tensions and fears. That's one question about the Egypt being Egypt being one of the most affected by the climate change because of the Nile. And then related to that, one student is asking in which way the new dam in Ethiopia is going to affect the region and if that's going to happen. So if you want, we respond to that and then we take the questions from the public.
Yeah, Egypt's agriculture depends on the Nile River, more or less, okay? This was already since ancient times. There's not much changed until these days, and the population is, of course, much higher than in the past, and it's strongly growing. So this combination of strong population rise in Egypt and dependence of limited water for food production is one of the major problems for Egypt. That's the reason that Egypt claims basically all the water from the Nile for itself and does not give much attention to the needs of the other upper riparian countries like Ethiopia or Sudan and so on because of historical claims. But I think all countries need to share the water, and there have been some negotiation attempts to share the water of the Nile, but Egypt was not happy about the outcome, and I think this is the best way. Otherwise, there's always the risk of some escalation of conflict, and Egypt has threatened Ethiopia to fill up its dam, the Grand Renaissance Dam, too fast. This would reduce water down the river. But I think the problems can be solved with negotiations without military force. And yeah, in the past, water conflicts have not often escalated to military escalation, because then the countries think the water issue is not so important and a military force cannot help solving these problems. So they're always then tempted towards negotiations and treaties. And I hope this will also happen for the Nile River.
Okay, entonces cogemos la pregunta.
Yeah, hello. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting indeed. I have the feeling that the concept of security has a lot to do with the citizens' perception, like on whether people see something as an imminent threat or not. And well, it is a fact that for certain sectors of society, climate change is still not an imminent threat for them. So, well, we have people denying climate change, international leaders calling it a hoax. So coming back to European scope, I would like to ask you, what are both national and international institutions doing wrong when it comes to disseminating climate change consequences? And what will it take for those sectors of people to see climate change as an actual threat to their lives? Thanks.
Yeah, the question is whether the institutions alone are to blame. It's an interaction between the institutions and the individual perception. And the individual perception is focusing on narrow windows, usually. Narrow windows in terms of time, space, and social connections. People are interested in things that affect themselves or their kids, okay? And climate change is for many people too far away. It's somewhere in the sky, it's somewhere else, maybe in Africa or in Asia. Then there's a flood in Germany. I think, okay, I'm sorry, my house was lost. Maybe it was unfortunate conditions for myself. I was at the wrong place. Something like that. people need to understand this is the whole future. Okay, and the future is not so far away. And this is probably more important that people follow the path that Fridays for Future was basically doing, that the future affects them. Of course, the young people more, because they have more future than the old generation has, and this expresses in the voting behavior also of the generations. But it's not that the young generation should blame the old generations. Okay, this is the wrong pathway. I think they work together and collaborate with each other. And the young and the old are in the same families. Each family has young people and old people. So we should overcome this intergenerational conflict in a way that we are all responsible. I think the responsibility issue is the main point. And this responsibility issue can be also strengthened by international institutions more.
Había otra pregunta por aquí. Bueno, allá, vale.
There was another question.
Thank you so much for the speech. I have a question that it's really a pleasure to hear that all the organizations and institutions are working in the area of Mediterranean area to, no matter building a sustainable system for climate change, to do some changes or try to have some deals and agreements. But I just wonder, I have a doubt that so many organizations and countries are working in this area. Do you think it's something which leads to low efficiency, or which leads to low efficiency, or actually it's a good thing? I doubt that. And also, I just wonder if now we have like a division of work to have different areas and different technology in different areas to build the sustainable the system. So that's my question.
I'm not so sure whether I understood your first question. The second was a division of labor or division of responsibility.
Because for me, it's a big area. And for example, speaking of the water, the sustainable water, because we have to satisfy the needs of people to avoid the conflicts. So I just wondering if we have started like building these kind of systems to help with the climate change, or it's still like in an agreement time, because I don't know if like so many agreements in all these countries are actually leading all these things low efficient.
Low emissions.
Low efficient.
Low efficiency.
Oh, low efficiency. Okay. Yeah, the efficiency is low because we are not using what is possible in terms of technology as well as to societal and infrastructure that we are needing. We waste a lot of energy. Okay, for instance, electricity production is a lot of waste of energy. Most of it is actually lost, and also in traffic or in housing, there's so much waste, and this waste is one of the things that we should avoid. Besides, so much of the discussion is actually on finding new energy sources, yeah. But it's not the only thing. The efficiency is problem, and the sufficiency is problem, and the saving of the resources is possible. And the saving means, this is the circular economy idea, okay? Try to minimize the losses and the waste in this whole process. Of course, you cannot have 100% circle of energy, because always some energy is lost into heat, but you can substantially reduce that. And for some other resources, it's indeed possible to close the loop and close the circle as much as possible. And for instance, household waste contains a lot of energy. And some of it is used. In the past, it was just dumped somewhere. This is in many countries is no longer possible, but still we are not efficiently using this energy that's in the products that we are wasting and putting on waste dumps. And yeah, so you make a good point that we should better use the waste and create a circular economy.
Vale, no sé qué está preguntando.
Hello. First of all, thank you very much for this presentation. It was very informative. And the question I wanted to ask was, you mentioned that governments were going to have to pay for most of climate initiatives. And I would like to point out that governments, when governments pay for something, it's not them paying for anything, it's their citizens via taxes. And it's obvious that the wealthiest, that the rich, are not paying their share, especially in the context of the recent Pandora Papers, which compound which compound previous revelations on the matter. And I would like to know if there is any discussion in the circles you've been part of, or any initiatives towards combating this tax avoidance or regulation, or to changing regulation that lets large corporations and large fortunes pay very small quantities in taxes.
Yeah, that's another very important point. Maybe one of the most important points is the wealth distribution in the world contributes to climate change. It's a wealth distribution on the side of the causing of the emissions. Of course, if your lifestyle is much higher, you fly more and you eat more meat and you have more wealth created in your life, many houses and so on. You have a much higher footprint, carbon footprint, than someone who is living in a slum and is almost consuming no energy and no products. So this contributes to this problem. You can put it also in historical context, because the rich nations have also higher footprint when you not only look at per year, but over the last hundreds of years, how much Germany, United States, United Kingdom have already emitted, and this carbon is in the atmosphere. Okay? This is their budget, carbon budget, which they have already created. This is on a national scale as well as on an individual scale. But how do you overcome this? Because it goes into it's a very political issue. If you say you want to take emissions away or wealth away from the rich people, you have to deal with the world's power structures. And they would call it a revolution or socialism if you claim equal rights for emissions per capita. Yeah, and then this is also a big issue in Germany now. Yeah, some parties want to tax the rich more, and others completely refuse it. Completely refuse this. It will be also a decisive issue, I think, for in the formation of the next coalition government, how this issue is resolved, because some want to increase taxes for rich and others not. So this is not a revolution, but they resist. Yeah, they say we don't want to have higher taxes, with the argument saying if the rich are rich, they invest more, and in the end everybody benefits from this wealth of the rich. But I don't buy this argument.
Neither do I. And the rich are investing primarily in what will net them the most gain, which is normally not renewable energy or climate change or initiatives to combat climate change. And maybe state intervention is required to change this or to compensate for this.
Yeah, this is a compensation argument. They say if I fly, I grow trees or support projects for growing trees. This is the normal argument. But it's not only the flying, it's the whole footprint of the rich people. They would have to invest a lot into low carbon projects or reducing carbon projects. If they actually do it, if they all would do it voluntarily, I mean, that would be a good contribution, but many don't want to do it voluntarily. Okay?
In relation to this, there is a question from the audience online who's saying, speaking about the main producers of CO2 and pollution, So as main producers of CO2 and pollutions, do you believe that the European Union and the United States have a responsibility to intervene in Middle Eastern affairs as it relates to famines, droughts, or other environmental crises going on, as you mentioned?
It depends on what intervention. Probably you don't mean military intervention.
No, I don't know. I don't think so. It's not clarified, but I guess it's not intervention. I guess
it's
more in relation to the initiatives you were mentioning, probably. Or
yeah, if it's just investment of meaningful projects that are agreed with the respective countries, then this kind of intervention is difficult to criticize. If it's meeting certain standards. If it's, I think all these projects should be done in agreement of the different parties and not against the will of the powerful against the less powerful. This is an important issue also for renewable energy projects like Desertec or so. It must be in mutual agreement. It must be not only the elites talking to each other and making this agreement, but as I mentioned, we have these different levels. We have government, business, we have scientists, we have NGOs, we have the whole population. They must be also taking part in this decision. So it must be a participatory decision-making process. Maybe not easy to organize, but I think if you have fantasy, you can think about this multi-level participation processes. Of intervention. So intervention is one direction, but it's two-way.
So, no sé si más preguntas del público.
I don't know if there are more questions from the audience back there.
Lilia, I'm actually also from Germany, and thank you so much for your presentation. It was very interesting. Because you mentioned gas and oil, I'm curious because there are also statistics about gas and oil companies, the major, I think, 20 gas and oil companies having an incredible impact on climate change. And I'm wondering if you see any potential in that sector of like restricting that sector or their actions in any way, or if you see any possibilities in that area.
You mean to move away from gas and oil?
Not only to move away, but also to restrict these 20 biggest companies that have such a major impact on climate change.
Yeah, restricting these companies is not so easy because they are often transnational companies. Okay, and it's not one government alone. Of course, each government can say within our national borders certain rules should apply, but they cannot completely control easily these companies. So it needs some international initiatives and activities. I think there are now some activities between nations going on trying to restrain the power of transnational companies. Also big companies in the social networks and so on, but also in the energy sector. But in the past they have been not very successful. And it can be done over tax. Now, why should big transnational companies sell their products or produce their products in a certain country and pay almost no tax? I mean, that does not make sense. So this taxing of the big companies is one major issue here.
Okay, because I'm guessing that the UN, for example, or the transnational or multinational organizations, that they would have a certain responsibility for overlooking that field or restricting that field or sort of maybe restricting their impact. Because I understand it's not a national issue, but there are transnational organizations, right?
Yes. Besides the taxing and the financial issues, it's important to develop sustainability standards that these organizations and companies should meet. Certain criteria should be developed. It can be done together with them or without them. I mean, there's a certain, for instance, in the bioenergy sector, there had been roundtables, bioenergy roundtables, which included companies, NGOs, governments, scientists, and so on, trying to find these standards that they should meet. have been not very successful so far, but at least there were some attempts. And there have been also for dams, big dams, there have been these commissions and so on. I think this is also something where the participation is very important.
Vale. Nos han pasado un poquito de tiempo, pero...
Now we're running a bit late, but there is yet another question from the online audience.
Because we're a bit already of time from the audience that are following online, is Professor Bara Mikhail also coming back to the issue of the country case studies. He's asking about the Palestinian case, and his question is what impact for climate change and water scarcity on the future of Palestinians?
Yeah, another good point. The problem is this imbalance, because the per capita consumption of water in Israel is higher, much higher than for the Palestinians, in particular for the settlers. And this is a power issue. You can say it's somehow really related to power gets more water. And there have been some negotiation roundtables also to overcome it, but it always fell victim to the conflict situation between Israel and the Palestinians. And the land issue, who's owning the land, who's settling the land. As long as the power issue is like that, it's very difficult. If there is no international mechanism, like the one we had in the 1990s for finding an agreement between Israel and the Palestinians, and water was part of this, actually, there was a moment where there were some hopes that this was possible until the assassination, I think Rabin was, yeah. And so you see always this interference of this conflict. There is a cooperation process going on, a multilateral process, many parties, and then there is some event, terror attack or war, and then this destroys the chances, and they have this continuous competition. And this is one of the most hardest and difficult cases, really, between Israel and the Palestinians.
Vale, pues si no, una última pregunta.
A last question.
First of all, also thank you for this speech. I'm sorry because the question I'm asking, I don't know if this has been spoken about before. I was unable to attend the whole meeting. But I had a question about this cooperation between European countries and MENA countries that could reach a transition from fossil energies to renewable energies. I don't know if there could be a common ground met between the owners of oil production and European countries. I don't know if you could explain more into that, or if there is already known common ground to reach there, or something like that. Thank you.
You mean if there's common ground on renewable energy projects?
Yes.
There's a lot of common ground. Indeed, I mean, I think many partners and participants, government level, business level as well as they are not happy about that. Maybe not the nuclear industry. There's also the attempt to nuclearize this region by selling nuclear reactors. But many participants are actually in support of renewable energy projects. It's only that there's not enough financing and not enough investment. This is the problem. It must have a source. And the governments don't have much money for these projects, so it's often international donor organizations which can make these small-scale projects possible. But the big projects, the large-scale projects, having a lack of investment. And investors want to have low risk. This region has, for many investors, still too high risk. So risk reduction, conflict reduction is very important to create a good investment environment, government investment as well as private investment. But you can have also grassroots investment. This is also a new trend that we experienced in recent years, that you have some projects are realized because small investors put their money together to make that project possible. And for them, the risk is not so important because they invest only a small amount, maybe 100 euro, 1,000 euro, But if there are millions of them, they can make these projects possible. This is crowd investment. So maybe, I'm not sure how strong it will be, but it's a chance.
Vale, pues estamos terminando.
Okay. We're drawing towards the end. If there are no further questions. You want to add a question?
Perhaps since MENA countries obtain most of their income from oil production, I don't know if they would be afraid to take further steps in that direction because they would be potentially cutting off their source of income and influence abroad. So I don't know if that is a problem or if there is a solution to that.
I did not fully understand this question. Did you?
No he entendido del todo la pregunta.
No, I meant that if you try to develop renewable energies and achieve a full transition to renewable energies in MENA countries, where I think, I'm not really sure, but I think that there is a strong interest in keeping oil energies afloat and being like an important source, a strategic resource. Therefore, I'm afraid that this might not be convenient to these countries to develop renewable energies there. I'm not sure if that would be a problem.
Es sobre la opción de algunos países para promover la.
Do you mean that possibly some countries aren't that interested in renewables because of the fossil fuels interests?
Renewables, how the countries that they have that.
I think I mentioned two examples, Egypt and Tunisia, having some projects, but other countries I think also would have interest, like Morocco. Morocco has already project. Israel, I think, has investment and having some solar power project, so it's possible. The question, what about the big Arabic states like Saudi Arabia? Saudi Arabia will be key. Because of the large area they have. So they have so much desert area that they could use for solar energy production on a very large scale. Yeah, they could move away from the oil sheikh to the solar sheikh if the political level accepts it, and if the cost of the oil becomes too high, and they cannot earn any money more, and then they're under pressure from the climate policy as well. The question, when is the tipping point when Saudi Arabia or other Arabic countries accept that they can make their future based on solar? They can still keep their power, but with renewables.
Yes.
Reducing consumption in northern countries, reducing consumption of
yeah, it's solar energy. The question how to transport it. Yeah, you have the infrastructure is another big problem. The whole energy infrastructure is relying on fossil. Okay, including the gas stations and so on. This needs big investment, and here the governments can really help to create the infrastructures for renewable, for also with hydrogen and electric cars and power grids lines between Europe and the Mediterranean region. But they need investment. All this infrastructure investment is not what private actors like. Yeah, this is what governments can support, these infrastructures to create. That was an important point in the end. Thank you for bringing us to this question.
I think this is a key question, and we should introduce here two variables, which are democracy on one hand, and the level of corruption in these countries as well. I mean, with these two variables, we can play and see how this kind of investments on infrastructures can be done. Even if we have a look to the European Union, we see that it's getting very, very difficult to improve the production of renewable energy because of the interest of the big companies involved. So.
Yeah. So capital and power are somehow related.
Yeah.
Bueno, pues con esto, si os parece, terminamos por hoy.
Okay, let's close for today. Thank you so much for joining us today in person and online. And again, thank you so much to Professor Scheffran. Thank you, Ruth, also, and all the coordinators of our master's degree. So, we will see Professor John Tolan on the 27th of October. He will be speaking to us about the European Grant Project.